One of the great benefits of Rockwell's Paymaster ASAs is their simple design, which provides you with easy maintenance and dependable operation. But let's talk about slack adjusters in general for a moment. Rockwell automatic slack adjusters are components that control air chamber stroke. As brake linings wear, the clearance between the linings and the drum is constantly increasing, making the air chamber pushrod stroke longer. The slacks must be adjusted to compensate for the longer stroke and lining wear. Now, you're probably familiar with manual slacks and the constant adjustment and maintenance they require. Crawling under a truck on the side of the road or taking it out of service to adjust the slacks isn't very efficient or productive. Paymaster ASAs are different, totally different. They automatically adjust for the constant increasing air chamber stroke, which occurs, remember, as brake linings wear. They do the work for you. All you have to do is keep them lubed and maintained properly to obtain a long service life. The Paymaster ASA is set at a proper working angle during installation. As the clearance between the brake lining and drum increases, the air chamber pushrod moves a greater distance to apply the brakes. If the stroke length is greater than the adjuster design limit, the ASA makes an adjustment during the return stroke of the air chamber pushrod. This adjustment automatically corrects for brake lining wear and resets the stroke to the correct length. To keep Paymaster ASAs in top condition, you'll want to make what's called a minor inspection according to the most frequent of three possible schedules: the schedule for chassis lubrication used by your company, the schedule for chassis lubrication recommended by the chassis manufacturer, or a minimum of 4 times during the life of the brake linings. The inspection and lubrication procedure is easy, too. For details, refer to Rockwell Field Maintenance Manual 4B. Now, here are some of the highlights. First, check the free stroke of the slack adjuster by measuring from the chamber face to the center line of the large clevis pin. Then take a pry bar and pull the slack adjuster until the linings make contact, and measure this distance again. The difference between these two measurements is the free stroke. On a drum brake, the free stroke measurement should be between 5/8 and 3/4 of an inch. For a double check, measure the adjusted stroke. Have someone apply the brakes using about 100 pounds per square inch of reservoir air pressure, which equals 80 to 90 psi in the air chambers. Measure again the distance between the air chamber and the large clevis pin, with the brakes released and then applied. The difference between the first and second measurements is the adjusted chamber stroke. There's a chart in the maintenance manual to help you find the proper adjusted stroke for your chamber size. The adjusted chamber stroke must be less than the amount shown in the manual. If the stroke is okay, it indicates the slack is installed and functioning properly. If the slack is not positioned properly, it must be adjusted. The adjustment procedure will be discussed later in this program. The second step in a minor inspection is to check the boot for cuts or damage. If the boot is okay, your third and final step is to lubricate the adjuster. Use a grease gun and lube the adjuster at the Zerk fitting until new grease flows from the pressure relief valve in the Paul cap screw. Refer to Field Maintenance Manual 4B for the proper grease. Functional problems such as swollen seals or gummy lubricants can occur if you don't use the approved grease. That's all it takes to perform a complete minor inspection. It's really pretty simple. You check the chamber stroke, inspect the boot for cuts or damages, and lube the adjuster. Now let's see what's involved in a major inspection. Besides inspecting the slack adjusters at recommended chassis lubrication intervals, you'll also want to check them when you reline the brakes. The procedure is essentially the same as a minor inspection. First, check the length of the adjusted chamber stroke. Next, inspect the boot for any cuts or damage. Then, remove the pawl and check the grease for contamination. Don't reinstall it immediately, because you could damage the teeth during brake adjustment. If the adjuster lubrication is not dry or contaminated, reline and adjust the brakes. Finally, reinstall the pawl and lubricate the slack just as you would in a minor inspection. So far, we've looked at how to inspect and maintain Rockwell's Paymaster automatic slack adjusters. And we found that everything we saw was in spec and okay. Now let's look at a problem. I've got a slack with a stroke that's too long, so I'm checking the troubleshooting chart in Field Maintenance Manual 4B. It's a good idea to start by checking the adjuster angle with the proper template. It's possible that the stroke could be long because the spring brake air chamber is not fully releasing. If that's the case, check the spring brake assembly and replace it if necessary. Next, remove the pawl assembly and check for wear or grease contamination. It looks okay. Of course, if it isn't, it should be replaced. The next check is the clevis and collar. Use a gap gauge and check for excessive wear. It has to be less than 60 thousandths of an inch. If it's more, replace the clevis and collar assembly. The clevis and collar seem to be okay, but there's something loose here. It's the jam nut on the push rod. That could cause the collar to shift a little and throw the slack adjuster angle out of spec. To reset the adjuster angle, simply use the same color template you used for installation. We're using the dark brown template because we're working on a tractor brake. Put the large clevis pin through the large hole in the template. The hole that matches the length of the slack adjuster must be centered on the camshaft. Look through the slot on the template. The small pin in the clevis must be completely visible. As you can see, this slack adjuster is at the wrong angle. Correcting the angle is a matter of readjusting the position of the clevis on the push rod until the small pin in the clevis is completely visible. Then retighten the jam nut to between 20 and 30 foot-pounds and adjust the slack manually to obtain the proper free stroke. Now reinstall the pawl assembly and torque to 15 to 20 foot-pounds. Here's another problem. During a minor inspection, we found a slack adjuster with a torn boot. This means that the interior of the adjuster is open to contamination. So the first thing to do is remove the pawl and check the grease for contamination. As you can see here, we've got contaminated grease and need to rebuild the slack adjuster because its internal parts may be contaminated or damaged. It's a bench procedure, so the first thing to do is to take the slack adjuster off the vehicle. The basic steps are these. Remove the pawl, if you have it already. Remove both clevis pins. Turn the manual adjusting nut to move the slack adjuster away from the clevis. Remove the snap ring and washers from the camshaft or power shaft, and remove the slack adjuster. Once you're at the bench, you can begin disassembly. First, cut the tie wrap and remove it from the boot. Then take off the torn boot and pull the actuator assembly. Next, use a small screwdriver to remove the piston retaining ring. Then, pull the ring out of the actuator. You can now remove the actuator rod, piston, and pin from the actuator. Remove the pin from the rod and piston if contamination or wear makes it necessary to replace the part. The next step is removing the worm assembly. Use a screwdriver to remove the grease seal. Remember, never reuse a seal. Once it has been removed, replace it with a new one. Then, remove the retaining ring with a pair of snap ring pliers. Now, turn the manual adjusting nut to wind the worm out of its bore. Next, remove the retaining rings and thrust washers from the adjuster gear. And push the gear out of the housing only until you can reach and remove one gear seal. Then push the gear out of the opposite side of the housing. Remove the other seal and push the gear the rest of the way out. Also look at the condition and fit of the clevis pin bushing. If it is worn or egg-shaped, remove it and replace it. Once the slack adjuster is disassembled, you'll want to make sure all its components are cleaned. Depending on the parts being cleaned, you'll use one of two methods. Use solvent cleaners to clean all metal parts that have ground or polished surfaces. These include the gear, worm, the actuator, and the inner bores of the housing. Use soap and water to clean all non-metal parts. Carefully inspect all parts after cleaning for signs of wear or damage. Replace them where necessary. The reassembly procedure is basically a reversal of the disassembly. First, lubricate and insert the gear into the bore. Install both seals on the gear and lubricate with grease. Lubricate and install the thrust washers, then the retaining rings. Install the worm gear to the bottom of the bore. Carefully install the worm gear retaining ring and seal. Insert the actuator rod and piston assembly into the housing. After installing the piston retaining ring, insert the actuator assembly into the housing. To install the boot, lubricate the rod, then slide the boot down. Use a silastic sealant and retaining clamp to secure the boot to the housing. Also, seal the top of the boot to the rod. Then, reinstall the pawl and torque to 15 to 20 foot-pounds. Use the recommended grease to lubricate the slack adjuster until grease flows from the relief valve in the pawl cap screw. Now, before reinstalling the slack adjuster, use a torque wrench that measures inch-pounds and turn the adjusting nut counterclockwise to rotate the adjuster gear. Rotate the gear a full 360 degrees. The torque should read less than 25 inch-pounds through the entire rotation. If the torque reading stays within spec, the slack adjuster is okay and ready for reinstallation. If the reading exceeds 25 inch-pounds, disassemble the adjuster again and check for the correct assembly and alignment of parts. To reinstall the rebuilt slack adjuster, see the Rockwell videotape entitled Installing Paymaster Automatic Slack Adjusters. It follows at the end of this program. Now let's review some of the highlights of the Paymaster ASA inspection and maintenance procedures. Remember first that all the procedures we've discussed, from inspection and maintenance to troubleshooting and assembly, can be found in Rockwell Field Maintenance Manual 4B. Minor inspections include a check of the adjusted chamber stroke, an inspection of the boot, and lubrication of the slack adjuster. Major inspections are made every time the brakes are relined. They include all the minor inspection steps, pawl inspection, and inspection of lubricant, plus, since the brakes are being relined, the stroke adjustment procedure, which is detailed in Field Maintenance Manual 4B. Finally, if you should run into a problem during your inspection, review this tape or refer to the troubleshooting chart in the manual. It gives you a number of areas to check to find the cause.